Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So this week I'm going to be tackling something that's been on my bench for quite some time and is inspired by Galaxy's Edge, or more specifically, the canister props you may have seen in the queue lines or around Black Spire Outpost. Now they haven't been in any Star Wars movies and they serve absolutely no purpose, so they'll fit in perfectly with the rest of my inconsequential Star Wars props. So let's get into it. After crowdsourcing a ton of photos from fellow Star Wars fans and determining the dimensions of the canister, I was able to start on a 3D model. I'm sure that this was made by gathering a bunch of different parts and materials and combining them, but I didn't want to do the full deep dive to hunt down those parts. So I recreated the design to the best of my ability in Autodesk Fusion. And like most of the 3D projects I do, it used the same few sketch shapes and extrusions to come up with the base model. I'd intended to make a silicone mold of the 3D print, then cast it in resin and form it over the canister like I think they're doing for the versions in Galaxy's Edge. But after trying it, I found it to be a bit more challenging than expected, and it really distorted the features of the model. So in an effort to make this easier on myself and anyone else who wanted to make one, I added a curved back to the model that will allow it to rest flush against the canister without any gaps. And when I thought the model was close, or as close as I could get it, I sent it to my resin printer, and while I waited, I could get started on painting the canister. Thanks to friends on Instagram, I learned that the base for this prop is a reproduction of a World War II German gas mask canister. The version in the parks is blue, but the canister I sourced was a dark gray-green. So I found a blue spray paint that looked the part, and after removing the straps that could be removed and masking the one that couldn't, I gave the canister a coat of paint. You'll notice that I didn't bother to scuff the surface before painting. I decided to skip it since this prop will only look better as it ages, so if the paint fails or gets scratched off, it'll only add to its character. With that out of the way, I could shift my attention over to the 3D printed panel. Or should I say panels? I printed these in pieces to remove the need for supports and cleanup, but we'll need to glue them together before I can do anything else. I used my 1, 2, 3 blocks to ensure that my prints aligned correctly, and once the CA glue set up, I could get on to filling the gaps around the edges. And for that I'll be using some UV reactive 3D printer resin. Typically I'd grab spot putty or epoxy sculpt to fill these gaps, but I figured I'd use the same material these parts were printed in to keep things consistent. Plus it will sand and accept paint in the same way, so I won't have to worry about any weirdness in my finish. For ease of filming, I applied the resin outdoors in the shade with a nylon brush and then held it in the sun to cause the ultraviolet light reactive resin to flash cure. This didn't last long since even in the shade there's still ultraviolet light. So after filming one side, I took it inside the shop and applied the resin to the remaining edges and cured them with a small UV light. When all of the edges were filled and cured, I wiped them down with a bit of isopropyl alcohol and then could get to sanding them flush. Now that the edges are relatively smooth, I coated the entire piece in filler primer and set it aside to dry for a while. Because we're having cooler weather, this filler primer can take some time to cure completely, and I didn't want to risk any weird paint reactions if it's not completely dry. A few hours have passed, my primer was dry, and I could coat the part in gloss black, starting with a dust coat and then a heavier coat, which uses the dust coat to hang onto and prevents accidental drips and runs in your finish. Because the piece is black, I needed to move it out of the sun to prevent the paint from blistering, so I grabbed a ruler and transported it into the shade where it could dry. When the paint was dry, I gave it a quick blast of air to remove any dust that may have landed on it or on my bench, and then could get to applying a metal finish. I'll usually do this with an airbrush, but I wanted to give it a go with this budget HVLP spray gun to see how I liked it. This was a perfect project for it since it didn't need to be perfect. But overall it worked pretty well, and I may use it in future projects. My plan is to use 5-minute epoxy to attach the panel to the canister, so off camera I marked off where the panel will be attached, and then I could do a bit of sanding with some 120 grit paper to make sure the pieces have a solid bond. Then I could mix up a bit of epoxy, apply it to the back of the panel, and set it in place. 5 minutes have passed and it's time to ruin that chrome finish with a bit of satin clear coat. The park version of this prop is really corroded looking and the chrome wouldn't have looked the part. Plus my plan is to use oil paints to grunge it up a bit, and it's always good to have a barrier between layers of paint to prevent unwanted reactions between the mediums. So this clear coat will not only seal the paint, it'll also help in its aging. And speaking of aging, I'm using raw umber and lamp black oil paints, and I'm doing my best to get it into all of the recesses of the panel before wiping some of it away just to get the right amount of dirt and grime in there. I like to work the paint around with the brush and with the rag to help vary its appearance, but it still needs a bit more dirt and dust. So I grabbed a bit of Fuller's Earth and added it to the panel while the paints were still workable so that the clay dust would have something to bond to. When I was happy with how the panel looked, I repeated the same steps on the rest of the canister by applying multiple layers with clear coat applied in between to lock the Fuller's Earth in place and give it a really dusty, aged look, like it's been hanging out in Uncle Owen's workshop on Tatooine. The last thing to do was grab my sandpaper and add some real scuffs and scratches to the surface for a bit of realistic detail. And at that point, I could call this one done. So there you have it, a Galaxy's Edge inspired Star Wars canister prop. I'd like to give a special thank you to everyone on Instagram who helped identify the canister, sent me photos for reference from both Walt Disney World and Disneyland Resort, and even helped me pick out the color blue. It's because of the Star Wars community that projects like this are possible, so know that I appreciate it. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.